Picture your bed right now. A mattress that arrived vacuum-packed in a box, unrolling itself in minutes, foam or steel springs quietly cradling every curve of your spine while you sleep. You barely register any of it as technology. It's just where you happen to sleep. But for nearly the whole of human history, lying down at night was not comfort. It was a nightly negotiation with cold ground, biting insects, and structures that had to be rebuilt, retightened, or replaced constantly. Softness, the kind you sink into without a second thought tonight, is one of the newest luxuries the human body has ever been granted. The story of how we got from bare earth to memory foam will change the way you climb into bed tonight. Start with what actually happens to your body at night, because it explains why the ground itself was the enemy. Core body temperature drops as you fall asleep, part of the body's natural rhythm, and a sleeping body loses heat far faster through direct contact with cold, dense earth than it ever loses heat to open air. Lie on bare ground for 8 hours, and the earth steadily conducts warmth out of you the entire time, hour after hour, the same way a cold tile floor pulls heat out of bare feet within seconds. Add dampness, insects, and uneven stone or root beneath your back, and a night on the ground stopped being restful and became something closer to an ordeal your body had to survive before dawn. Every mattress in history, however primitive, was solving that one physics problem first. Get the body up off the ground, insulate it, and stop it losing its own warmth all night long. Go back far enough and bed simply meant a heap of dried leaves, grass, or reeds, piled on the ground and refreshed whenever it rotted or filled with insects. Archaeologists excavating Sibudu Cave in South Africa found layered bedding made of rushes and sedges, dated to roughly 77,000 years ago. Underneath those layers sat bands of ash, evidence that early humans were deliberately burning old, infested bedding before laying fresh plant material on top. Even 70 millennia ago, someone had already worked out that the place you sleep can quietly kill you, one bite, one parasite at a time. That single insight, keep the sleeping body separated from the ground, would drive almost every invention that follows, for tens of thousands of years afterward. Ancient Egypt was the first civilization to lift sleep off the floor in a genuinely engineered way. Egyptian beds, some dating to the First Dynasty, were low wooden frames strung tightly with plaited flax cord or leather strips, woven into a springy, load-bearing surface that flexed slightly under the sleeper's weight. Off the ground, scorpions and biting insects were a slightly smaller threat, and the desert's rising night damp couldn't seep upward quite so easily. Pharaohs slept on frames with legs carved into lions' paws, and instead of a soft pillow, rested their necks on a curved headrest carved from wood, ivory, or stone, angled to hold the head clear of the frame entirely. Comfort, in the way we define it now, was almost beside the point. This was elevation, status, and hygiene, engineered out of wood and rope, and only the wealthy could afford it. Wealthy Romans took that same corded principle and piled a stuffed layer on top, a lectus frame strung with webbing, loaded with wool-stuffed cushions called culcita, arranged for reclining as much as sleeping. Ordinary Romans, soldiers and laborers, slept on the ground or on simple straw pallets, exactly like almost everyone else on Earth at the time. Comfortable sleep, for most of recorded history, was not a human default. It was a privilege bought with rope, wool, and rank, and denied to almost everyone who actually worked for a living. That same woven rope idea eventually spread through the centuries across Europe, becoming the ordinary household bed for close to 1,000 years. A wooden frame, rope laced back and forth across it in a tight grid, and a stuffed sack laid over the top. Rope stretches under weight. Night after night it slackened, and the sleeper slowly sank closer to the floor until the ropes were hauled taut again with a wooden key or lever, a chore repeated in households across an entire continent. Here's the part nobody tells you. The popular story that this weekly chore is where we get the phrase, sleep tight, is almost certainly folk etymology, not documented fact. The earliest recorded use of the phrase dates only to 1866, and by then metal bed springs already existed in wealthier homes, undermining the timeline the rope story depends on. Language historians instead traced tight back to a much older English meaning, soundly or securely, with no rope involved at all. It's a wonderful story. It simply isn't a true one, and that gap between the story we repeat and the fact underneath it turns out to describe this entire history rather well. What sat on top of that rope grid mattered enormously, because it sorted households by class as clearly as their clothing did. 19th century domestic guides ranked stuffing materials from finest to poorest. Down, then feathers, then wool, then horsehair, then cotton, then straw, wood shavings, and sawdust for households with nothing else at all. A feather bed was valuable enough to be named specifically in wills and passed down between generations because down and feathers were genuinely, seriously expensive. Most households instead slept on pallets of straw or hay, or, in colonial America, mattress ticking stuffed with dried corn husks, refreshed at harvest, and hosting whole ecosystems of vermin in between refreshes. Bedbugs were so embedded in ordinary life across medieval and early modern Europe that people scattered wormwood or ash around the frame and beat the straw before bed, simply hoping to knock the worst of it loose for one more night's sleep. The wealthy fought the same cold, biting night with a different tool entirely: fabric. Grand four-poster beds, heavy with curtains on every side, weren't primarily decorative. They were a sealed microclimate built around the sleeper. Drawn shut, the curtains trapped body heat, blocked drafts through unglazed or poorly glazed windows, and gave at least the illusion of privacy in houses where entire families, and often servants or guests, routinely shared the same room and sometimes the exact same bed. A four-poster bed was, in effect, a small heated tent built directly around the exact problem this whole story keeps circling: how to stop losing your own warmth overnight in a house with no other source of heat once the fire burned down. On the other side of the world, Japan solved the identical problem by refusing the bed frame altogether. Sleeping mats began as a mark of nobility in the Heian period. Centuries before the cotton-stuffed futon we'd recognize fully emerged during the Edo period, from the 1600s onward. Each night, sleepers unrolled padding directly onto woven tatami floors, and each morning folded it away into a dedicated closet, clearing the room for daytime use. No frame to rot in the damp, no springs to sag, no bulky furniture permanently claiming the room around the clock. It wasn't a lesser solution to the sleeping problem. It was a completely different answer to the exact same nightly threat: how to separate a sleeping body from cold, damp, insect-ridden ground without giving up the room itself. Back in Europe, the invention that finally broke the rope and straw pattern for good didn't come from the bedding trade at all. It came from industrial metallurgy. In 1857, a steel coil spring was patented, originally intended for upholstered chairs, not beds at all. In 1871, a German-born upholsterer working in America, Heinrich Westphal, is credited with building the first true innerspring mattress. Individual coils bound together into one supportive unit, sewn inside a fabric casing. It should have been an overnight sensation. It wasn't. For roughly 60 years, innerspring mattresses stayed expensive, awkwardly engineered, and rare, while most homes kept sleeping on stuffed cotton and straw ticking exactly as their grandparents had. In 1899, an inventor named James Marshall patented individually wrapped pocket coils, each spring sewn into its own small fabric sleeve so it could compress independently of its neighbors, rather than the whole mattress moving as one unit. That single refinement would eventually make mattresses far quieter and far better at following a body's actual shape, instead of reacting as one rigid, solid slab that transmitted every movement across the whole bed. The real tipping point only arrived after the Second World War. Soldiers returning home to new suburban houses furnished them with the era's mass-manufactured comforts, and the innerspring mattress, by then cheaper and far better engineered, quickly became the assumed default in ordinary homes. Within a single generation, an object that had barely existed through most of human history, a mattress designed purely around comfort rather than survival, was treated as an unremarkable bedroom necessity. Memory foam followed in the 1960s and 70s, developed initially through aerospace cushioning research before it ever touched a bedroom. Its slow-recovering foam, engineered to spread impact loads evenly across a surface, instead of concentrating pressure at the shoulders and hips the way older cotton ticking always had. By the late 20th century, mattress companies were selling adjustable firmness, individually numbered settings, and abstract sleep data refinements no rope bed owner could have imagined, still chasing the exact same physics problem that Ash Layer in a South African cave was solving 77,000 years earlier, with nothing more than fire and dried reeds. Put every chapter side by side, and a clear pattern appears. Every culture solved. How do you sleep safely tonight differently? Wood and flax cord in Egypt, wool cushions in Rome, curtained frames and rope grids across Europe, tatami mats and folded cotton in Japan. But every one of those solutions was engineering, arrived at through trial, failure, and generations of repetition, never mere luck or accident. Elevating the body, refreshing the fill material, choosing fibers that resisted pests, tightening whatever had sagged overnight. None of it was decorative, and none of it was optional. It was daily physical labor, repeated by hand, night after night, for thousands of years, purely so a human body could lie down without being eaten alive, frozen through, or slowly swallowed by damp earth. What we quietly lost along the way is worth naming honestly. A corded rope bed, tightened by its own owner's hands every week, was understood, maintained, and repaired by the very person sleeping in it, using nothing but a wooden key and patience. A vacuum-sealed foam mattress arrives instead as a sealed unit that nobody but a factory worker or a machine has ever opened or even touched. We traded intimacy with our own bedding, and often intimacy with the people we once shared a bed and a room with, for convenience and privacy, and most of us never even noticed the trade happening around us. So the next time you flop onto a mattress that quietly adjusts to your spine without you doing anything at all, think about the rope bed you'd once have had to retighten yourself, by hand, every single week, with nothing but a wooden key and your own patience. We didn't just buy softness. We bought distance from our own bedding, and often from the people we used to share a room with just to stay warm. Comfort arrived. Intimacy left quietly out the back door, and almost nobody noticed it go.
Ah, I understand. Follow, and see you next time. For another thing, you'll never look at the same way again.